A lot of the toxicity in the Duelyst community only really existed behind closed doors. And it was mostly just some of the old school players flaming the developers, like the famous story surrounding rigging Duelist worlds. Ooh, that's actually a really good story to tell. So back years and years ago, during the Duelist World Championships, um, the meta game was not in a good spot. Let's be perfectly honest. We had the meltdown meta, and then it was everybody was super tilted about the meltdown meta. I remember casting tournaments during the meltdown meta, and it's funny because when I first started casting tournaments, that was during the old Kara meta, back when Kinetic Surge would give +1/+1 to units in your hand, and it stacked. So the meta at the time was you just played Kara with as many opening Gambit minions as you could, plus Saberspine Tiger. You used the opening Gambit minions, who were generally understated, to make up for their ability, except with Kinetic Surge, you gave them bonus stats, and suddenly they were good bodies on top of having really, really excellent like tempo effects when they came into play. And then you had Saberspine Tigers that were like getting bigger and bigger in your hand. And most like finals were Kara versus Kara. It was literally like an S tier deck. Like it could not lose. You could only beat it if you were playing Kara and you got better RNG with your Saberspine Tigers getting into your hand early and stuff like that. And it was super boring because both players would end up having to go to opposite corners of the map and surround themselves entirely with minions so that they couldn't get rushed down by Saberspine Tiger. It was the definition of a degenerate deck because it was the best deck in the game. It could only lose to itself, and it led to extremely boring, uninteractive play. Like it was literally the worst meta, I think, technically. There's been like really bad metas, but in terms of like the effect they had on the way the game is actually played, I think old Kara was probably the worst example. And that was the meta game that I started casting first in tournaments. So taking such a shitty meta and such a boring playstyle and trying to hype it up and make it seem like it was interesting to viewers was a huge challenge for somebody who had just gotten into tournament casting. And it was, to be honest, one that I think I handled quite well. And that's why Vanar can't have nice things. Yeah, I mean, it's true. Then we had the Meltdown meta, and there was a handful of games where what Meltdown would hit, whether it would hit face or kill a minion, would decide the game. It was way too swingy for Duelist. Meltdown was created because the developers wanted to capture some of the hype and excitement surrounding the card, like the way Hearthstone had Ragnaros, right? The developers wanted to capture some of that hype. Ragnaros the Fire Lord, for those of you who aren't familiar with Hearthstone, is a minion that can't attack, but at the end of your turn will deal 8 damage to something, right? Randomly. Could hit face or it could hit one of the enemy minions. Yeah, that's the thing. Trying to make a card like Ragnaros is a bad idea. And it was really ironic because as soon as Meltdown was announced, Hearthstone released an update that they were actually rotating Ragnaros out. Yeah, exactly. As soon as Meltdown was released, the Hearthstone developers released a statement saying, listen, Ragnaros is actually a really terrible idea, and this much swingy RNG shouldn't be deciding tournament games, so we're rotating him out. So Duelist sort of got left holding the bag at that juncture, and so we were stuck with Meltdown. And it was a pretty cool, and honestly, it was a pretty interesting concept. Because I think it was also a way to kind of push the Bloodbound spells at the time. But what ended up happening is it also like really warped the metagame. It came down to who can run the strongest late game deck with Meltdown in it, because basically once Meltdown came down, it just became like a survival fest. You needed the ability to survive to the late game to play your Meltdown. You needed to have a good Bloodbound spell to cast for your Meltdown. And then you needed to have the ability to swarm the board so that you could have multiple targets to stave off your opponent's Meltdown. And basically, Vanar had all of those. If your board was empty and Faye played Meltdown into Warbird, you took 9 damage to face. One of the major differences too between Meltdown and Ragnaros was that, again, Ragnaros couldn't attack normally. The random RNG 8 damage was like a substitute for its attack, but Meltdown was a 7/7 minion. So you couldn't actually get close to it. It was like this big artillery unit that would punish you for being close or punish you for being far away. There was a ton of debate about should it be nerfed so that it hits the closest target so that you can sacrifice stuff to it and use it in use certain units to tank Meltdown. The big issue again was that again it could attack, so it was always a threat. If you were too close to Meltdown, it would hit you for 14 damage. They eventually nerfed it. It used to be a 7-mana 7/7 that dealt 7. They changed it to an 8-mana 6/6 that dealt 6 or something like that. The real shame is we didn't have a chance to replay old puzzles from 2016. Oh yeah, the Duelyst puzzles. Those were a good time. Ooh, we've got a post from Zix. But anyway, to keep going on my story about the Duelyst World Championships, and then Duelyst, and then again Meltdown was nerfed, and we ended up in this really weird meta where nobody could outvalue Vanar, right? Arcanist Vanar was the be-all, end-all because of Blue Conjurer, where it would create whenever you cast a spell, it would create an Arcanist in hand. And because Arcanists also fed off of you casting spells, it was like this feedback loop balance value engine that was just like way too strong to take down. It just went over the top of everything. To be honest, Arcanist Vanar was like an honorary trial, right? In terms of like the late game value that it was capable of. And eventually people were like, this was old Mechazor, where it was summon 5 mechs and then you got like a big spell immune ranged unit in the corner, a big 8/8. And so it came down to Arcanists are very, very strong and they have a lot of late game value. So we have to try to take them down quickly. Now, the issue with Arcanist Vanar, you have to remember, is that all of Vanar's spells were mostly defensive, right? Hailstone Prison, Frigid Corona, Chromatic Cold, Aspect of the Fox, Aspect of the Bear. No, this was actually before Aspect of the Bear, I think. Aspect of the Bear. Was Aspect of the Bear in the game at the time? I do remember Aspect of the Fox. This was back when it was 1 mana, right? And then there's Trinity Wing, which would also create spells in hand, and one of those spells would heal you for 3. So basically the issue was that Vanar had a lot of really, really cheap spells with very defensive abilities, so that you could use spells to shut down aggro. No, Aspect of the Fox is 2 mana now. It used to be 1 mana. But that was like one of the big issues, was that typically a late game deck like that would just lose to more aggressive lists, but because of Vanar's suite of spells, they were able to stave off aggressive decks. So you had to go cheesy, and then people realized that if you summoned Mechazor really, really fast, Vanar couldn't deal with it because Mechazor back in the day was spell immune. And that was one of Vanar's only ways to deal with Mechazor, was to have like maybe Chromatic Cold or something, right? So it became like this really weird arms race between Mechazor trying to high roll out the Arcanist deck. And then the ultimate cancer hit of people realizing that you can run the Arcanist shell, but also put mechs in your deck. So then you had mech arcanist hybrid decks going toe to toe against each other, and it was just awful and super boring to watch. Um, but that was like that the way it ended up playing out was that the world championship came down to like just a really degenerate meta that nobody liked, and a lot of the quote unquote pro players for Duelyst were very spiteful of the developers at the time, right? They felt like the competitive scene was, they didn't like CPG. They felt they wanted Duelist to fail. They didn't care for the tournaments at all, um, and so they basically did everything in their power to undermine the competitive scene. There was talks of collusion amongst the players. There was talks of that, like the famous story of we rigged Duelist Worlds type dealio. The thing is that narratively for the casting desk, it was actually really hype because the underdog of the tournament basically came up with the Mechazor like anti-Arcanist technology like right at the last minute, in order to fight it, which was kind of cool. I still remember losing in an open board when I had total board advantage with a ton of minions to Amara Healer. My opponent is sub 5 life. He gets an RNG double meltdown proc and deals 14 to my general. Ugh. Yeah. I mean, I tried to climb during the meltdown meta was when I was making like one of my first like real pushes for S rank, and I was playing Sirocco Saj, and that deck was super hard to pilot against Vanar because this was back when they also had Old Frostburn. Vanar had Old Frostburn, which just dealt with Sirocco like immediately. Oh boy, I can feel the pain coming out today. What's up, Alexicon? The answer to Megazord back then was to tech a Crossbones or two. Yeah, but that's sort of like the story surrounding the Duelist World Championship, and of course there was like all kinds of memes and stuff. Uh, and you know what I mean. The same people who are still playing Duelist to this day and getting to S rank are the same players that were doomsaying it for the last like 2 or 3 years, regardless, that it was going to shut down, and that the developers had driven the game into the ground, and that they should have changed it from being a two draw game, etc. Which again isn't to talk shit on these people. I'm basically just letting you know that they were, yeah, I mean, they were right in the long run. But basically to say that the overall, yeah, I thought for sure Dragall was going to win. He had my vote. If you remember back during the casting desk, we did caster predictions, and Dragall, even back during like the top 16 or like the top 32, when we were like really early in the bracket, I was like, Dragall's got it. He was like my favorite competitive player, like after the scientist. And the interesting thing too is that I don't know if you all remember the scientist. Um, he was he was kind of like, this is a weird analogy, but stick with me. Scientist was like the Michael Jordan of Duelist, where, to simply put, the level that he played at was so much higher than everyone else at the time that it was mind blowing, right? I have 100% of the achievements for Duelist on Steam. Nice. I haven't looked at the Steam achievements for Duelist. There's like a few hidden achievements and stuff. I don't know if I ever grinded them out, but I'll have to look into that. That's too bad. But yeah, let's open it up. Steam Duelist achievements, because that is going to be something that we need to look into. But the scientist basically was taking the competitive scene by storm. He was like by far undeniably the best Duelist player at the time. And he ended up retiring super early in like his Duelyst competitive career in order to he was like going to school to be like an astrophysicist or like something crazy like that.